Yo guys, so I wanted to take some time to talk about Fearless Draft. For the uninitiated, it's the new drafting mode that's slowly being deployed in more and more, I would say, minor leagues for now. But there is a world where this could eventually actually just keep scaling, keep growing, and keep adapting and be deployed in even major leagues. And eventually, if it's really successful and it's really exciting, which it potentially is, can be something that we can use or can even define the idea of drafting in the future. So for those that don't know, the idea is basically the fact that once a team picks a champion, that champion basically can no longer be used for the rest of a series. This format does require that games are played in a series though, so it's not applicable to every single game. So we'll have to see. People are still tinkering with the way that it works and the idea behind it, because there's a lot of adaptation that can be done here. And there's a lot that this brings to the table, and actually there's a lot to break down because of it. Because even though it's one simple change of that champions can't really be picked again, it completely redefines how drafting is done. Because of the little intricacies and interactions between champions and the fact that champions are removed, and as series go on, it's really putting a lot of pressure and excitement, I guess, on the coaching staff and players to understand what things are gone and having the intuition to really adapt, right? In this video, I wanted to really talk about what are the pros of a format like this, what maybe are some downsides, honestly, because there are some, and highlighting some new strategies as well as understanding adaptations that I think could be viable for the format, so that teams could make this into something that's really sustainable. So, touching on the upside, the first one, it's all pretty obvious. It's going to be really exciting to see more champions be played into, almost like in a forced sense, because teams have to play more champions in a series, right? The fact that we get to access almost basically the entire pool of all of the cool different champions that League has to offer, I think is an exciting viewer experience, right? If we think about what the average player plays and what different champions, seeing your champion on the big stage is always an exciting feeling, and seeing players cook up new strategies with such champion and really performing on them is, I would say, a really cool highlight that something like League has to offer compared to basically any other esport, right? There's no other game that really has such an extensive and developed depth of different champions, and understandably so. It's on us to really come up with ways to creatively implement that. And I think this is a good implementation. And it just creates for new combinations that we may not see before. And we're gonna see storylines of different series and in new, almost like infinite depth in terms of what teams are doing. There are some flaws to this format that I can highlight, because there are some. We've seen it when it was tested in the past, because it kind of pushes the limits of what League of Legends Pro play can be. The first one is, of course, having a really extensive champion pool, because let's say if it's up to a best of 5, you're going to have to play 5 unique champions. And although for some roles and some players that should be no issue, and you would probably expect that from a salaried player, when you're playing at the highest level and your differentiator between win and loss is contingent on, let's say, a couple of different mistakes, it's no wonder why a lot of players stick to just a couple of champions at a time. And it gets more complicated when certain matchups are not available, and you really get into the depth of things with this. It forces that, and you kind of get both the good and the bad that comes out of it. Another one is actually, it's pretty visually confusing to kind of see because of the way it currently works, which is when you see champions that are picked, obviously you have to display that on stream somehow. And when you see it on stream, it'll show the champions that are gone. But in its current state, it's only showing you only need to show it for each side and what champions per side that are gone. So you might see, oh, Heimer's gone, but it's only gone for blue side, so red side can still take it. So we still have to think of creative ways to display this information so that it's not really confusing for the player. And that's something to keep in mind as well. Obviously, as a result, this could potentially reduce the quality of play, because when you're forcing so many different comps and so many different champions, and although you could argue that League teams should be able to adapt to this and just have a variety of styles available, you're going to see some shit shows. And we've seen that deployed already in a couple of the formats. It's really funny, but I'm not sure if that's like the best competitive integrity experience. And that's something to consider. This last one's more of like a counter to this format, in which case teams could have just compositions for each game as the champions they pick are gone. And, because there's usually enough viable champions to present different combinations of compositions, this just means that, each player is just gonna deploy this comp in game 1 and then deploy a different comp in game 2 once we use the game 1 champions up. And that's basically the same version, in my eyes, as what drafting was before. Because once you deploy, or once you kind of settle down to what the meta is, there's not much creativity anymore, because those champions are just going to be prioritized in that order every single time, right? That's typically how it goes in the highest levels of play, because it's all about playing averages. No one wants to cook too much because there's so much at stake. That's why it's being tested out in these amateur leagues and whatnot, so that we understand what outcomes are possible with this format. Now, touching on potential strategies. There's a lot of cool things you could probably cook with a format like this. I'll give some examples. The first one being, you can actually do some anti-stratting based on what you think the enemy team is going to pick. So you have different comps prepared for when the enemy picks a certain comp or leans into a certain comp. You can kind of tap into that while making sure that you have the resources from that pool still available, right? This is going to be a lot of load on the coach to understand, okay, now that these champions are gone, our conditions are met to be able to play this comp, and this comp actually goes up in value because of that, and therefore we should pick it in game 2 instead of game 3, blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot of like mind fucking that's going on between the two teams. And I think that's something that this format can play to. The other ones are supplemented by a couple of format changes that I think are actually pretty healthy for this format potentially. The first one is that I think bans are still viable in this format, because it kind of still leans into that creativity. I don't see a reason why it needs to be gone per se, because as the games develop and as champions are picked, the bans will also develop. So I think that still achieves the goal of making it interesting. It could make it complicated if that's a concern, which is valid, but I can see a world where both exists. Something that would potentially simplify the visual experience, but also make it super interesting, is making champions unique across both teams. Then you have things like takeaways and anti-stratting, and really cutting into champion pools that really challenges the modern league player, I guess, right? It's like, imagine that in the best of 5, like you have to tap into almost like, it's like 100 different champions, and you have to come up with combinations that we've never seen before, right? We're gonna see bot lane pairings, like let's say right now, we see a lot of bot lane pairings that are very, very typical: Xayah Rakan, Lucian Nami, Samira Nautilus, things of that nature, right? But as each champion is taken away, and this could promote like champions being picked in other roles to force pools to be smaller. Like, I think this is a super interesting way to force teams to get creative ways of both picking things but also denying things. And I think that's what builds the layers of draft that makes it more interesting and forces teams to be creative on the fly. Before, compared to just having effectively a flowchart of things. Oh, if this is banned, we pick this. If this is gone, then we'll do this to counter, right? It's very methodical at this point, and you almost want to say draft is solved at this point, because we've had so many years where players and teams are understanding this is the matchup you play here. Okay, if this is gone, then you react with this, right? There's kind of like a process behind it, but we need to shake up that process to make it interesting. Otherwise, we're going to see the same champions in the same slots in the same roles and whatnot, and we're going to see similar priorities. Like, there's a reason why the same like 80 or so champions are the most picked, right? There's a certain criteria of champions that define a good competitive champion, but we want to challenge that norm, and we want to introduce champions and new strategies because there are so many unique ones, and we want to kind of encourage that a little bit more, right? So that's the idea behind this. I hope these topics were insightful in terms of exploring this topic, and I'm just super excited to see the way we direct Fearless Draft in the future. So yeah, thanks guys.